The warm Australian sun painted golden streaks across the morning sky as Prince George pressed his small face against the cool window of the royal car. His breath fogged the glass as he watched the strange new landscape roll by. Everything looked so different from home in England. The trees were taller and had funny-shaped leaves, and the birds he glimpsed were colors he had never seen before. "Are we almost there, Papa?" George asked, bouncing slightly in his car seat. His excitement had been building since breakfast, when his father, Prince William, had reminded him about their special day planned at Taronga Zoo in Sydney. William smiled at his son through the rearview mirror. "Just a few more minutes, George. Can you see the harbor from there?" Kate, sitting beside George, gently smoothed down his unruly hair that always seemed to have a mind of its own. "Remember what we talked about, sweetheart. We'll see lots of animals today, but we need to listen carefully to what the zookeepers tell us." George nodded seriously, though his eyes sparkled with anticipation. He had been learning about Australian animals at school before their trip, and his teacher had shown him pictures of kangaroos and koalas. But seeing them in real life would be completely different. He clutched his small backpack, which contained his favorite stuffed lion and a notebook where he planned to draw all the animals he would meet. As their car wound through the streets of Sydney, George noticed how different everything looked from London. The buildings were lower and spread out more, and the sky seemed bigger and bluer. People walking on the sidewalks wore lighter clothes, and many had sun hats that reminded him of the ones his grandfather Charles sometimes wore in his garden. "Look, George," Kate pointed out the window as they approached the zoo entrance. "See those tall poles with the colorful flags? Each one represents a different animal that lives in the zoo." George counted the flags silently, his lips moving as he concentrated. There were so many that he lost count after 15. His stomach fluttered with excitement and a tiny bit of nervousness. He had been to zoos before, but never one in a different country, and never with so many people watching him. The car slowed as they approached the entrance gates, where a small group of zoo staff waited to welcome them. George could see camera flashes going off from behind a barrier where reporters stood, but his parents had explained that this was normal and he shouldn't worry about it. His job was just to enjoy learning about the animals and have fun. "Are you ready for your big adventure?" William asked as the car came to a stop. George took a deep breath and nodded. Through the gates, he could already hear the distant calls of exotic birds and the chatter of other families beginning their own zoo adventures. Somewhere beyond those paths were the animals he had only seen in books and on television. Real kangaroos that could hop as tall as his father. Koalas that spent most of their day sleeping in eucalyptus trees. And maybe, if he was very lucky, he might even see a Tasmanian devil, though he hoped it wouldn't be as scary as the cartoons made them look. Kate unbuckled his seatbelt and helped him gather his backpack. "Remember, we're guests here in Australia, so we want to show everyone how polite and curious we can be." As the car door opened, the warm Australian air rushed in, carrying with it the sounds and smells of the zoo. George could hear the splash of water, probably from a seal or penguin enclosure, and the distant trumpeting of an elephant. The air smelled different too, cleaner somehow, with hints of eucalyptus and something else he couldn't identify, but that made him think of adventure. The zoo director, a kind-looking woman with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, stepped forward to greet them. She wore the distinctive khaki uniform that George had learned was typical of Australian zookeepers, and her smile was warm and genuine. "Welcome to Taronga Zoo, Your Royal Highnesses," she said with a slight bow. "And you must be Prince George. We have some very special friends waiting to meet you today." George looked up at his parents, who nodded encouragingly, then stepped forward with the careful politeness he had been taught. "Thank you for having us," he said clearly, though his voice was barely above a whisper due to his excitement. The zoo director's smile widened. "We're absolutely delighted you're here. Now, shall we begin your adventure? I believe our first stop will be with some animals that are uniquely Australian, ones you definitely won't find in any English zoo." As they walked through the entrance gates, George felt a thrill of anticipation run through him. The path ahead curved around a corner, disappearing from view behind lush green plants and trees he didn't recognize. Somewhere along that path waited creatures he had only dreamed of meeting, and he was about to discover them with his own eyes. The first stop on their zoo tour was the Australian Walkabout exhibit, where native animals roamed in spaces designed to look just like the Australian wilderness. George's eyes widened as they approached a large, open area where several kangaroos were grazing peacefully on the grass, paying no attention to the visitors watching them from the designated pathways. "Those are eastern gray kangaroos," explained Sarah, their enthusiastic zookeeper guide who had joined them at the entrance. "They're actually quite large, aren't they? Much bigger than most people expect." George nodded, mesmerized by the way the kangaroos moved. When they hopped, they looked almost like they were flying in slow motion, their powerful hind legs propelling them effortlessly across the ground. One smaller kangaroo, which Sarah explained was a joey, peeked out from its mother's pouch, its dark eyes curious about the visitors. "Can we go closer?" George asked quietly, not wanting to startle the animals. "We can walk along this path," Sarah replied, leading them to a viewing area that brought them within about 10 feet of the kangaroos. "But these animals are free to move around as they please, so we need to let them come to us if they want to." As if responding to her words, one of the medium-sized kangaroos began hopping slowly toward their group. George held his breath, hardly believing that a real, wild Australian animal was approaching him. The kangaroo stopped just a few feet away and sat back on its haunches, regarding George with intelligent dark eyes. "He's beautiful," Kate whispered, reaching for her camera to capture the moment. William knelt down beside George, bringing himself to his son's eye level. "What do you think, George? Pretty amazing, isn't it?" George could only nod. The kangaroo was so much more magnificent than any picture could have shown him. Its fur looked soft and thick, colored in shades of gray and brown that seemed to shimmer slightly in the Australian sunlight. Its ears twitched constantly, listening for any sounds that might signal danger, even though it appeared completely relaxed in the presence of its human visitors. "Why does he look at us like that?" George asked Sarah, his voice full of wonder. "Kangaroos are very intelligent animals," Sarah explained. "They're naturally curious, just like you are. He's probably trying to figure out what kind of strange creatures we are, since we walk on 2 legs but don't hop like he does." The kangaroo suddenly stood up on its hind legs, towering above George, who realized for the first time just how tall these animals could be. But instead of being frightened, George felt even more amazed. The kangaroo's movements were so graceful and powerful at the same time. "In the wild, kangaroos live in groups called mobs," Sarah continued as they watched more kangaroos gathering in the distance. "They look out for each other and communicate through different sounds and body movements." As they moved further along the path, they came to another enclosure where several wallabies were sunbathing on rocks. These smaller cousins of the kangaroos were much more active, hopping playfully around their habitat and occasionally stopping to groom themselves or each other. "Oh, they're like little kangaroos," George exclaimed, delighted by their playful antics. "That's exactly right," Sarah laughed. "Wallabies are from the same family as kangaroos, but they're smaller and live in different habitats. These particular wallabies are rock wallabies, which means they're excellent climbers." As if to demonstrate Sarah's point, one of the wallabies suddenly bounded up a steep rock face with incredible agility, its small paws finding purchase on surfaces that looked impossible to climb. George watched in amazement, trying to imagine how it would feel to be able to jump and climb like that. "Could I ever learn to hop like a kangaroo?" George asked his father seriously. William chuckled. "Well, you could certainly try, but I think you might find it quite difficult. Kangaroos have very special muscles and bones that make them perfect for hopping. But humans are better at other things, like using tools and solving problems." Their next stop was the koala enclosure, where George finally got to see the animals that had become symbols of Australia in his mind. The koalas were even more adorable than he had expected, with their round, fuzzy ears and button noses. Most of them were sleeping, curled up in the forks of eucalyptus trees like living teddy bears. "Why are they all sleeping?" George asked, slightly disappointed that the koalas weren't more active. Koalas sleep about 20 hours every day, Sarah explained. The eucalyptus leaves they eat don't give them very much energy, so they need to conserve their strength by sleeping most of the time. One koala, positioned lower in its tree than the others, opened its eyes and looked directly at George. It had the most peaceful expression George had ever seen, as if it didn't have a care in the world. The koala yawned widely, showing its pink tongue, then settled back into its comfortable position and closed its eyes again. "He looks so cozy," George observed. "I wish I could take naps in trees." Kate smiled at her son's comment. "I think your bedroom is probably more comfortable than a tree branch, don't you?" As they walked between exhibits, George noticed how different this zoo felt from the ones he had visited in England. Everything seemed more spread out and natural, with native plants creating environments that looked like the animals' real homes in the wild. The air was filled with the sounds of birds he didn't recognize, creating a constant background chorus that reminded him he was very far from home. "Are there any scary animals here?" George asked as they approached their next destination. "Well, that depends on what you think is scary," Sarah replied with a smile. "Our next stop is going to introduce you to some animals that might look a little fierce, but they're actually quite fascinating once you learn about them." Their path led them to a large, naturally landscaped enclosure where several Tasmanian devils were active in the late morning sun. George had been both excited and nervous about seeing these animals, having heard their fearsome name, but not really understanding what they were like in real life. "They're much smaller than I thought they would be," George said with relief, watching as one of the devils wandered around its habitat, sniffing at various objects with great interest. "That's what most people say," Sarah laughed. "Tasmanian devils are about the size of a small dog, but they have very strong jaws and teeth because they're scavengers. In the wild, they help keep Tasmania clean by eating animals that have died." One of the devils approached the viewing window where George stood, pressing its black nose against the glass. Its fur was jet black with white markings across its chest, and its ears were surprisingly pink on the inside. When it opened its mouth in what looked like a yawn, George could see the impressive teeth that made these animals such effective scavengers. "Why are they called devils?" George asked, fascinated despite his initial apprehension. "Early European settlers heard them making very loud, scary sounds at night," Sarah explained. "They can screech and growl quite loudly, especially when they're competing for food. But during the day, like right now, they're usually quite peaceful." As if to demonstrate this point, the devil at the window began grooming itself, licking its paw and using it to wash behind its ears, just like a cat might do. The action was so ordinary and peaceful that George found himself smiling. "He's actually quite cute," George admitted to his parents. William nodded. "It's interesting how animals often aren't what they first appear to be, isn't it? Sometimes the scariest sounding names belong to animals that are quite gentle." Their next stop brought them to an elevated walkway that offered spectacular views of Sydney Harbor. George had been so focused on the animals that he had almost forgotten they were in one of the world's most famous cities. From the zoo's vantage point, he could see the iconic Sydney Opera House in the distance, its white shell-like structure gleaming in the sunlight. "Wow," George breathed, momentarily distracted from the animals by the beautiful view. "It looks like a giant seashell." "Many people think that," Kate agreed, taking photos of George with the harbor in the background. The architect who designed it was inspired by nature, just like many of the things we're seeing in the zoo today. But their attention was soon captured by the chattering and movement in the trees above them. A family of ring-tailed lemurs had claimed the high branches overlooking the walkway, and they seemed very interested in the human visitors below. Their long, striped tails hung down like fuzzy ropes, and their large, expressive eyes watched every movement with curiosity. "Those aren't Australian animals," Sarah explained as George watched the lemurs with delight. "They come from Madagascar, which is an island off the coast of Africa. But we have them here because they help people understand how important it is to protect island habitats around the world." One of the lemurs suddenly leaped from one branch to another with incredible grace, its long tail helping it balance in midair. George watched in amazement as the entire family began moving through the trees, jumping and swinging with what looked like pure joy. "They look like they're having so much fun," George observed. "Lemurs are very social animals," Sarah replied. "They spend a lot of time playing together and grooming each other. Play is actually very important for intelligent animals because it helps them learn and stay healthy." As they continued their tour, they encountered the Australian reptile house, where George came face to face with some of the continent's most famous scaled residents. Behind thick glass barriers, various snakes coiled and slithered in carefully controlled environments that mimicked their natural habitats. "That one's huge," George exclaimed, pointing at a massive python that was easily twice as long as his father was tall. "That's a carpet python," Sarah explained. "They're not dangerous to humans, but they're very good at catching birds and small mammals. See how slowly and carefully it moves? Pythons are ambush predators, which means they wait patiently for their prey to come close, then strike very quickly." George watched, fascinated, as the python's tongue flicked out repeatedly, tasting the air. "Why does it stick its tongue out like that?" "Snakes smell with their tongues," Sarah told him. "When they flick their tongues out, they're collecting chemical information from the air that tells them what's around them. It's like having a super-powered nose." In another enclosure, several blue-tongued lizards basked under heat lamps. Their bright blue tongues looked almost comical against their brown and tin-patterned bodies, and George couldn't help but giggle when one of them yawned, displaying its colorful tongue for several seconds. "The blue tongue is actually a defense mechanism," Sarah explained. "When predators see that bright blue color, it startles them and gives the lizard a chance to escape." "It would certainly startle me," William commented, making George laugh. Their exploration of the reptile house also introduced George to some smaller, more colorful inhabitants. Several species of geckos clung to glass surfaces with their amazing toe pads, and George was delighted to learn that these tiny lizards could walk up walls and even hang upside down from ceilings. "How do they stick like that?" George asked, pressing his own hand against the glass to compare. "They have millions of tiny hairs on their feet that work like molecular glue," Sarah explained in simple terms. "Each hair is so small you can't see it, but together they create enough attraction to hold the gecko's weight on any surface." George tried to imagine having feet that could stick to walls and ceilings. It would certainly make climbing trees much easier, and he could probably reach the top shelf in his playroom without needing to ask for help. As they prepared to leave the reptile house, George noticed a large monitor lizard lounging in a sunny corner of its enclosure. The lizard was perfectly still, but its eyes followed their movement, and George had the distinct impression that it was much more aware of its surroundings than it appeared. "Is he sleeping?" George whispered. "No, he's just being very efficient with his energy," Sarah replied quietly. "Cold-blooded animals like lizards don't waste energy on unnecessary movement. But if he needed to, that monitor lizard could move very quickly indeed." As they stepped back into the warm Australian sunshine, George felt like his mind was expanding with all the new information he was learning. Each animal had its own special adaptations and behaviors that made it perfectly suited for its environment. And he was beginning to understand that the natural world was far more complex and fascinating than he had ever imagined. The afternoon sun was getting warmer as their zoo adventure continued toward the aquatic exhibits. George could hear the sound of splashing water growing louder as they approached what Sarah announced would be one of the highlights of their visit, the seal and sea lion pools. The first thing George noticed was how graceful the animals became once they entered the water. On land, the sea lions had seemed clumsy and awkward as they hauled themselves across the rocky surfaces with their flippers. But the moment they slid into the crystal-clear pool, they transformed into underwater dancers, spinning and gliding through the water with incredible elegance. "They're like water ballerinas," George said in wonder, pressing his face close to the underwater viewing window. A young sea lion seemed to notice George's fascination and swam directly toward the window, floating effortlessly in front of the glass, as if posing for a photograph. Its whiskers twitched as it examined this young human visitor, and George could see intelligence sparkling in its dark eyes. Sea lions are incredibly smart animals, Sarah explained as George and the sea lion continued their mutual observation. They can be trained to follow complex commands, and in the wild, they have sophisticated social structures. Could he learn to shake hands like a dog? George asked, still mesmerized by his aquatic friend. Actually, sea lions can learn to do much more complicated things than that, Sarah replied. Some sea lions have been trained to help scientists study the ocean by wearing special cameras and diving to depths that humans can't reach safely. The sea lion suddenly pushed off from the window and rocketed through the water with powerful strokes of its flippers, demonstrating the speed and agility that made these animals such successful hunters in the wild. George watched as it joined several others in what looked like an aquatic game of tag, weaving around each other in patterns too complex and fast for him to follow. How long can they hold their breath underwater? George asked as he watched them dive and surface repeatedly. Some sea lions can hold their breath for up to 20 minutes, Sarah told him. They have special adaptations that allow them to conserve oxygen when they dive deep to catch fish. Their next aquatic encounter was with the penguin colony, and George was delighted to discover that these weren't the large emperor penguins he had seen in movies, but smaller, more colorful little penguins that were native to southern Australia. They're so tiny, George exclaimed as he watched the penguins waddle around their rocky habitat with serious expressions on their faces. Little penguins are the smallest penguin species in the world, Sarah explained. They're only about a foot tall, but they're excellent swimmers and can dive down to catch small fish and squid. George was enchanted by the way the penguins moved on land, their upright posture and determined waddle making them look like tiny people in formal wear rushing to important meetings. When they entered the water, however, they became as graceful as the sea lions, zipping through the pool like small, feathered torpedoes. One penguin climbed out of the water and shook itself vigorously, sending droplets flying in all directions. Its feathers were a beautiful blue-gray color on its back and pure white on its front, and George could see how this coloring would help camouflage it in the ocean. Why are they darker on top and lighter on bottom? George asked, always curious about the reasons behind what he observed. That's called counter-shading, Sarah explained. When a predator looks up at a penguin from below, the white belly blends in with the bright surface of the water. When a predator looks down from above, the dark back blends in with the depths of the ocean. So, they're wearing natural camouflage? George said, pleased with his understanding. Exactly right, Sarah confirmed. Nature has given many animals built-in disguises to help them survive. As they moved through the zoo, George began to notice these patterns everywhere. The way certain birds had colors that matched their favorite trees, how some insects looked remarkably like leaves or twigs, and how even some of the larger mammals had markings that would help them blend into their natural environments. Their exploration led them to the Asian elephant enclosure, where George experienced his first close encounter with one of the world's largest land animals. The elephant was enormous beyond his imagination, with wrinkled gray skin that looked ancient and wise and small, intelligent eyes that seemed to hold secrets about the world. She's called Malika. Sarah introduced them to the matriarch of the small elephant family. She's 42 years old and has lived here at Taronga Zoo for most of her life. George watched in amazement as Malika used her trunk with incredible precision to pick up small objects, manipulate her food, and even scratch behind her own ears. The trunk seemed to have a mind of its own, constantly moving and exploring, touching everything within reach with gentle curiosity. Her trunk has over 40,000 muscles, Sarah told them. That's more muscles than we have in our entire bodies. She can use it to pick up something as small as a single blade of grass or lift something weighing several hundred pounds. Malika suddenly approached the barrier where they stood and extended her trunk toward them, not quite reaching, but clearly interested in these new visitors. George could see the two finger-like projections at the tip of her trunk moving independently, and he understood that this was essentially the elephant's hand. "Does she want to touch us?" George asked quietly. "She's probably just curious about your scent," Sarah replied. Elephants learn a lot about their world through their sense of smell, and their trunks are incredibly sensitive. William lifted George up so he could get a better view of this magnificent creature. From his elevated position, George could see other elephants in the background, including a much smaller baby elephant that stayed close to what was obviously its mother. Elephants live in family groups led by the oldest female, Sarah explained as they watched the family interactions. They're very emotional animals and care deeply about each other. They've been observed comforting family members who are upset and even seeming to mourn when one of them dies. George found this information both fascinating and somewhat sad. He had never thought about animals having feelings the way people did, but watching Malika gently touch the baby elephant with her trunk, it was obvious that there were deep emotional connections within this elephant family. "Do they remember things for a long time?" George asked, recalling something he might have heard about elephant memory. "Elephants have excellent memories," Sarah confirmed. "They can remember other elephants they haven't seen for decades, and they remember where to find water during droughts, even if they haven't been to those places for many years." As they prepared to move to their next destination, George took one last look at Malika, who was now using her trunk to spray dust on her back. He wondered what it would be like to have lived for 42 years and remembered everything that had happened during that time. It seemed like it would be both wonderful and overwhelming to have such a perfect memory. As their zoo adventure drew toward its conclusion, Sarah led them to what she had saved as a special surprise, the Australian Night Animals exhibit. Even though it was still afternoon outside, this building was kept dark so that visitors could observe nocturnal creatures during their most active period. George's eyes needed a few moments to adjust to the dim lighting, but soon he could make out several different enclosures housing animals that would normally be fast asleep during daylight hours. The atmosphere was mysterious and exciting, filled with soft sounds of movement and the occasional call of an unseen creature. "This is like being in a different world," George whispered, instinctively keeping his voice low in the darkened space. Their first encounter was with a group of sugar gliders, tiny marsupials that looked like flying squirrels with enormous bright eyes. These creatures were incredibly active in the artificial nighttime, gliding from branch to branch using the membrane of skin that stretched between their front and back legs. "They're so small," George marveled as one of the sugar gliders landed on a branch just inches from the viewing window. "How do they fly without wings?" "They don't actually fly," Sarah explained softly. "They glide from tree to tree using those skin membranes like a living parachute. In the wild, they can glide up to 50 meters in a single jump." George watched in fascination as the sugar glider's large eyes moved constantly, scanning its environment for both food and potential dangers. Its tiny hands looked almost human as it gripped the branch, and when it groomed itself, the movements were quick and precise. "Why are their eyes so big?" George asked. "Big eyes help them see better in the dark," Sarah replied. "Most nocturnal animals have adapted to collect as much light as possible during nighttime hours." In the next enclosure, they encountered a family of bilbies, rabbit-like creatures with long ears and pointed snouts. These animals were busy digging in the sand of their habitat, using their powerful claws to create elaborate burrow systems. "Bilbies are very special animals," Sarah told them with particular enthusiasm. "They're endangered in the wild, which means there aren't very many of them left. Zoos like ours are working hard to breed bilbies so that hopefully one day we can help increase their numbers in the wild." George felt a sudden sadness learning that these charming creatures were in danger of disappearing forever. "Why are there so few of them left?" "Many reasons," Sarah explained gently. "Their habitat has been changed by human development, and other animals that don't naturally belong in Australia have been brought there and compete with bilbies for food and territory." One of the young bilbies approached the viewing area and began digging energetically in the sand near the window. George could see its long, sensitive nose constantly twitching as it searched for hidden insects and roots. The animal's fur was soft gray and white, and its ears seemed too large for its small body. They looked like they should be in a fairy tale, Kate observed, taking careful photos in the low light conditions. Many indigenous Australian stories feature bilbies, Sarah agreed. They're often portrayed as clever, resourceful characters who use their digging abilities to solve problems and help other animals. Their exploration of the nocturnal world continued with an encounter that made George both excited and slightly nervous. A large, glass-fronted enclosure that housed several species of Australian spiders. While some were quite small, others had leg spans that stretched across George's entire hand. "That one's enormous," George said, pointing at a particularly impressive huntsman spider that sat motionless on a piece of bark. Huntsman spiders look scary because they're so big, but they're actually quite gentle, Sarah assured him. They don't build webs to catch their food. Instead, they hunt by running very quickly to catch insects and other small creatures. George studied the spider's 8 long legs and the way it held perfectly still, as if it were a decoration rather than a living creature. "How fast can it run?" "Fast enough to catch a cockroach," Sarah replied with a smile. They're actually considered beneficial spiders in Australia because they help control pest insects in people's homes. As they moved through the exhibit, George encountered several other fascinating nocturnal creatures. There were powerful owls with piercing yellow eyes that could rotate their heads almost completely around, fruit bats hanging upside down with their wings wrapped around their bodies like dark cloaks, and even an echidna, one of only 2 mammals in the world that laid eggs instead of giving birth to live babies. "The echidna is one of Australia's most unusual animals," Sarah explained as they watched the spiny creature use its long snout to probe for insects. Along with the platypus, echidnas are monotremes, mammals that lay eggs. George tried to imagine what it would be like to hatch from an egg instead of being born the way he was. The echidna's babies would start life in shells, just like birds or reptiles, but then drink milk from their mothers like all other mammals. As their zoo tour reached its end, they emerged from the nocturnal house back into the bright Australian afternoon. George blinked in the sudden sunlight, feeling like he had just returned from a journey to a dozen different worlds. His notebook was now filled with sketches and notes about all the incredible animals he had encountered. "What was your favorite part of today?" William asked as they walked slowly back toward the zoo entrance. George thought carefully about this question. There had been so many amazing moments. The kangaroo that had approached him so fearlessly, the graceful sea lions dancing underwater, the wise old elephant with her incredible memory, and the tiny sugar gliders gliding through their artificial forest. "I think I liked learning that all the animals are so much more than they look like in pictures," George said finally. "They all have special abilities and interesting personalities, just like people do." Kate smiled at her son's thoughtful answer. "What do you think you'll remember most when we get back to England?" "That animals everywhere are connected," George replied, surprising his parents with the depth of his observation. The zookeeper said that protecting animals in Australia helps animals everywhere, and that all the ecosystems are connected somehow. As they reached the zoo entrance where their car waited, George turned back for one last look at the paths that had led him on such an incredible adventure. Somewhere beyond those trees and enclosures, all those remarkable creatures were continuing their daily lives, eating, playing, caring for their young, and simply being themselves in all their wild magnificence. "Can we come back someday?" George asked as they settled into the car for the journey back to their hotel. "I think that would be a wonderful idea," William replied. "Maybe next time you'll be old enough to help with some of the conservation work that zoos like this are doing." George liked the idea of being old enough to help protect animals. As their car pulled away from Taronga Zoo, he pressed his face against the window one more time, watching the entrance grow smaller in the distance. But the memories of his day with the amazing creatures of Australia would stay with him forever, inspiring a lifelong love of the natural world and all its incredible inhabitants.